Hey guys, so if you're watching this video, chances are you use the program Anki pretty regularly, and a lot of you guys probably don't actually know how Anki actually operates behind the scenes. I mean, how the algorithm actually works and how Anki decides when you should see what cards and what the four buttons that you're given when you're reviewing actually do. And so I also went many years without learning this, and when I finally did learn it, it completely revolutionized the way that I use Anki because I was able to recalibrate a lot of the settings and then basically use the four buttons differently, and that allowed me to basically just have way less reps with the same retention rate. Because the way Anki is set up by default, it's pretty inoptimal for learning languages. So, although it might be a little dry, I really encourage you guys to stick with me in this video because if you're going to continue to spend so much time on this program every single day for many years to come, you want to actually at least have the settings calibrated the way that are going to be most optimal, right? And you want to be in control. You want to be able to customize it for your own experience and just basically know what's going on. And so in this video, I'm just going to be explaining how the Anki algorithm works exactly, what the four buttons do exactly, but I'm not going to go into how to use that knowledge in order to calibrate the settings. I'm going to do that in the next video because this video is already going to be pretty long, just understanding the nuances of how Anki actually functions. So let's jump into it. So Anki basically sorts all the cards you have into certain different categories, right? So on Anki, we can go to the browser. And by the way, this is a new profile I made just for the sake of this video, temporary profile. And this is a deck that one of my patrons gave me because I don't currently have my own Anki deck, and I needed a deck that has reviews and new cards. So thanks to the patron who gave me their deck. I don't know if they want me to say their name. So we can go to Anki, we can see all the cards that we've made or downloaded from someone else's deck. And right here, we have the two basic categories that cards can be sorted into. We have new cards and then learned cards. So when a card is blue right here, what that means is that we've never seen the card before. Anki is assuming that we don't know the knowledge contained within the card yet. It's brand new, we haven't seen it before. On the other hand, learned cards are cards that Anki knows that we have seen before, and it's assuming the knowledge is already contained in our head. So this is something that's already learned, and Anki's job is to keep you from forgetting it. And so that's an important distinction. But if we click on this deck, we'll see a third category, which is learning cards, which basically gives us now three categories: cards that are brand new, you've never seen before, cards that are in the process of becoming learned, and then cards that are already learned, and the knowledge is already contained within your head. Now, if we go into the statistics page, we can see that Anki actually breaks down learned cards, these green cards, into two further categories, which are young cards, which is this light green, which means that the interval on the card is less than 21 days, and then mature cards, which means that the interval is over 21 days. So now we can basically sort all of the cards that are contained within your Anki deck into four categories: a brand new card, a card that you're in the process of learning, a card that you already know but is still young, and then a card that you already know and is mature. But for the sake of this video, all we really need to worry about are these three categories: new cards, cards that are in the process of being learned, and then cards that are already learned. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to be calling these three categories blue cards, orange cards, and then green cards respectively, just because that's going to make it easier to keep track of in our heads. Now, one note I want to make here is that there's two different types of cards that you're going to be finding in this orange category. The first category is when a new card, you begin learning a new card, and then it goes from blue to orange. And that's the most standard way. But also, if you have a card that you're supposed to know, a green card, and you fail that, it will go back into the orange category, but it's treated a little differently. So when you're learning something for the first time versus when you're relearning something that you already knew, they both show up kind of the same, as in that they both add to this number right here, but they get treated a little differently within Anki. So it's important to remember the difference between new cards and then lapses. Lapse is the word for when a card goes from being green to orange. When you fully knew it at one point and then you forgot it, you unlearned it in a way. That is a lapse. So when a card goes from being blue into orange and then you fail it, that's not a lapse. When a card's already in orange and you fail it, that's not a lapse. It's only when it's green and you sent it to orange because you failed the green card. That's what a lapse is. So now let's go and look at basically how the Anki algorithm actually works. So to do that, I just want to explore all the settings within Anki. And so before that, I just want to make this note that if you go to Tools, Preferences, right here, you will find settings that are kind of global to Anki. It affects the program as a whole and all your decks. But what we're more concerned with in this video is when you go to the side of your deck, you click this gear and then go to options, we have these option groups. And so option groups are more specific settings that actually affect the algorithm and what the buttons do and affect your reviews. And if you click right here, you can make as many option groups as you want. You can make each deck have their own option group, or you can make multiple decks use the same option group. It's up to you. But basically, yeah, this is what we're going to be concerned with in this video. So as you can see, we have 5 tabs over here, and by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what each one of these options actually controls. So let's start with new cards. So I'm going to turn off reviews right here, just so that I can show you what a new card looks like. So when we actually, go into Anki, we're studying a new card. We can see it's a blue card, show answer. Anki gives us 3 options here. So in order to understand what these options do, we have to go back into the settings. So you'll see right here that the first option in new cards is steps in minutes. So basically, once you perform a review on a new card, so a card shows up, it's blue, and you press a button on it, it will automatically enter the learning queue. It will become an orange card. And so what happens to a new card once it's orange is determined by the numbers in this box. So basically, what this means right here is that when a new card comes up and you click fail, it's going to show up in 1 minute. And then if you fail it again, it's going to show up in 1 minute again. And it's just going to keep showing up in 1 minute until you press good on the card. Then it's going to move to the next step. It's going to show up in 10 minutes. And if you pass it at the end of the 10 minutes, then it's going to graduate, which means that it goes from being an orange card to a green card. It becomes fully learned. Anki says, okay, you now have successfully learned this card, and we will now keep it in your memory as a learned card. So if we were going to add a third step and we set 100 right here, then what would happen is when a new card comes up, if you pass it the first time, you skip the first step. So if a new card comes up, you press good, it's going to show up in 10 minutes. If you press good again, it's going to show up in 100 minutes. At the end of 100 minutes, if you press good, then it will graduate. And what the interval is going to become after it graduates is determined by this box right here, graduating interval. So if we made this 3 days, then what would happen right now is a new card comes up, you fail it, comes up in a minute, you pass it, comes up in 10 minutes, you pass it, comes up in 100 minutes, you pass it, and now it is graduated, and it will show up in 3 days from now, because that will be its starting interval as a learned card. So basically, these two they don't affect each other, right? You can have like as many steps as you want, and like, let's say, for example, that we had this number right here, which I have no idea, but let's just say that's like 3 months. So we can say, okay, it comes up in 100 minutes, you pass it, comes up in 3 months, then you pass it, and then it goes back to having an interval of 3 days, even though you had already gone a month without seeing it. So you can make this make no sense if you want to. The default is just 1 and then 10. So you can make it as many as you want, and you can make them as big as you want. But yeah, the default is 110, which means that we'll see right here, when we're reviewing, if we click again, it's going to show up in 1 minute. If we click good, it's going to show up in 10 minutes. So if we change this right here to be like 3 or 2 and then 30, then when we review a new card, we'll see it's now 2 minutes and then 30 minutes. And now we also have this easy button right here, which says 4 days on it. And so what that means, what that is that there's this option right here called easy interval. And basically, at any point in the learning process, so let's say you had, like more steps. So let's say the card shows up, you fail it shows up in 2 minutes, and then at the end of the 2 minutes, you just feel like, I know this card really well. I don't need to see it again in 30 minutes or 100. I can just blast this into the future because I already know it. Then you can press the easy button. It will bypass all the steps, and it will give it a graduating interval, basically, of whatever you have in this box. So you can make this the same as the graduating interval, or you can make it higher. And so if you make it the same as graduating interval, then basically it's the same as going through all the steps, but it just lets you skip the steps and go straight to the end result if you press easy. But if we made this, for example, like 10 days, then if you press good, then it's going to show up in 30 minutes. Press good, it's going to show up in 100 minutes. Press good, it's going to show up in 3 days. Or press easy, it's going to show up in 10 days. So it's just the starting interval it affects this. And so this only affects the very beginning of the life of the card. And so if we make this 10 days, we'll see that now when we go to study a new card, it's 10 right here. So you can control all three of these settings completely in the option groups. Now I have to mention that how many buttons there are and what the buttons do change depending on what category the card is in, whether it's a blue card, an orange card, or a green card. So now you know what happens when you're studying a blue card and an orange card that used to be a blue card, right? So you study a card, right now it's blue. If we clicked again, well, now it's an orange card and it's going to show up in 30 minutes and it's going to have the same options. So now you know basically how new cards function. But now we're going to talk about how learned cards function. And this is the real important part because a card is only a new card once, right? But then once a card is learned, you continue to see that card for as long as you continue to use Anki. So you're going to be spending a lot more time with learned cards than new cards. And so if we go back to these option groups, under new cards, so now I have to just, be comprehensive and tell you what all the settings mean. So now you know what the steps are. That's what's going to happen to the new card before it graduates. Order, this is just whether you want to see your new cards in the order that you made them in or in just a random order. That's pretty, self-evident. Then how many new cards it introduces per day. So you can have 100 cards, but you can tell it to only show you 20 of them a day. Graduating interval, you know what that is now. Easy interval, you know what that is now. And then we have starting ease. And so the ease factor is a concept I'm going to talk about in a second here. That's extremely important when it comes to the Anki algorithm. And it's basically how quickly your intervals grow. So this is what the ease factor is going to start out as, and that's going to make more sense in a second. And then barrier related new cards until the next day. This is just basically how, for example, if you're making closed cards, you can have many different cards part of the same note, right? So if you have a sentence and you close two different parts of the sentence, that will make two cards. One for the first close, one for the second close, but they'll be part of the same note. They're kind of grouped together in Anki. They're like sibling cards. And so if you check this box, then if you review one, and then it will hide the other one just for that day so that you don't review two different versions of the same card on the same day. So I like to keep this checked off, but it doesn't make too big of a difference. So now we can go to the review tab. And so first, let's just take a look at, so if I have to turn on reviews because I turned them off a second ago. So this first tab right here, this is just the maximum reviews that Anki will show you in a day. And so, for example, if we make this 999 today, we have 220 reviews, which means Anki says there's 220 cards today that the algorithm says you should review today in order to keep them in your memory. But if we made this 50, then it's going to just choose 50 out of those 220 and only show me those 50. It's at a lesser number because I already tried to film this video once and moved two of these to the learning queue. So, yeah, and so you definitely want to have this at just 999 because if Anki, you want to be reviewing all the cards Anki says that you should review today. Otherwise, the algorithm's just going to completely break down, right? If Anki's saying, hey, study this today, and you just don't, then what's the point of using Anki? So you want to keep this number as 999 so that you see all the cards that are actually due today that Anki actually thinks you should study. So now let's go into Anki. And so now if we click show answer on a green card, we'll see that we have 4 options instead of 3. And what each of these buttons are going to do is going to be completely different because now we're talking about a learned card instead of a new card. So if you're reviewing a card and you just click on the browser, it's going to open up that card in the browser. So we can see here we have this card right here. And on Anki, if you press Control-Shift-I in the browser on a card, it will give you these statistics about that particular card. So we'll see that we have an interval, 1.3 months, which most of you will probably be familiar with. That's how often you see a card. That's obviously very important, but right under that we see ease as 250%, and that's how fast the interval is going to grow. And so this is the same as the starting ease, right? Because the default starting ease is 250%, that's what we saw. But now I'll explain to you what this actually means. So what happens when you press the good button is it takes the previous interval, which was, I just forgot, which was 1.3 months, and it's going to multiply that by the ease factor. So it's just going to take 1.3 months times 2.5, and get the new interval. And really, what's actually happening is Anki's taking the previous interval, multiplying it by the ease factor, and then multiplying it by this fudge factor, which is basically just randomizes the new interval by a few percentage points, just so that, like, say for example, you made 2 cards on the same day, and for both those 2 cards, you always just press good. Well, if Anki's algorithm was simply to take the previous interval and multiply that by the ease factor, then you would always see those 2 cards on the same day, right? Because the interval would grow at the exact same rate. And that wouldn't be good, because then you might associate those 2 cards with each other in your head, even though that you just happen to make them on the same day and they have no connection at all. So in order to avoid that issue, Anki just randomizes the interval by a few percentage points, just so that you're not always seeing the same cards on the same days. And so really, it's the previous interval times the ease factor times a randomized few percentage points. But we're just going to forget that for the rest of this video, because it's a really tiny number and there's nothing you can do about it. And it doesn't really affect anything that we're concerned with when it comes to the Anki settings. So for the sake of this video, you can just think that the good button takes the previous interval and multiplies by the ease factor, and that's it. So that's the simplest button. It's the most standard button. And so now let's talk about, what does the easy button do? Well, if we go into the settings and we go to reviews, we'll see that there's something here called the easy bonus. And right now it's set to 130%. So what that means is that Anki is doing something extra when you press the easy button. It's taking the previous interval, multiplying it by the ease factor, and then multiplying that by the easy bonus. So in this case, 130%, which means it would take 1.3 months, multiply it by 2.5, get 4.1, then multiply that by 1.3 and get 5.5. So it's just going to grow the interval by 30%, in this case, more than it would grow the interval if you press good. And you can change that number in the settings, right? You can make that 150% if you want. But that's not the only thing that the easy button's doing. That's how the easy button affects the interval, but the easy button also adds 15 percentage points to the ease factor. So what that means is that, for example, if we look at this card, we see it has an ease factor of 250% right here. And so now I'm going to mark this card, and now I'm going to press easy on it. If we go back to the browser and look at the card, it now has an ease factor of 265%, which means before, when it was 250, right? So when the card came up, when you pressed the good button, it was going to multiply the previous interval by 250. Now that you've raised the ease factor, when the card comes up again, even if you just press good, not easy, it's going to be multiplying the previous interval by 265 instead of by 250. And so the interval is now going to grow exponentially larger for the rest of the card's life, because the ease factor affects the rate at which it grows. So anytime you're changing the ease factor, you're not just making a change in that instance, you're making a change to how the card is going to grow for basically the rest of the life of the card. So it's more permanent for that card when you change the ease factor. So now we know what these 2 buttons do. When you press good, it takes the previous interval and it multiplies it by the ease factor. When you press easy, it takes the previous interval, multiplies it by the ease factor, multiplies it then by the easy bonus, and then it adds 15 percentage points to the ease factor. So now what does the hard button do? Well, the hard button is the least customizable button out of these 4. You can't really control what it does in the settings, but what it does is it takes the previous interval, it multiplies it by 1.2, regardless of what the ease factor was. It just multiplies it by 1.2, and then it subtracts 15 percentage points from the ease factor. So just to demonstrate this real quick, if I mark this card, see right now it has an ease factor of 230. Well, now if I press hard, go back to the browser, and look at the card again, we'll see now it has an ease factor of 215. And so once you press hard on a card, unless you press easy, because easy is the only button that raises the ease factor, the good button doesn't change the ease factor, the hard and again buttons lower the ease factor. So easy button is the only way to raise the ease factor of a card. So if you press hard on a card, even one time, if you don't press the easy button to even that out, then basically that card is going to be growing slower for the rest of eternity, because now it's always getting multiplied by 15% less than it would have been before. And it compounds, right? If you press the hard button 3 times, well, now you're down 45 percentage points from the original interval, and then it's going to be growing 45% slower for the rest of time. So now what does the again button do? Well, the again button lapses the card, right? It takes the learn card and it puts it back into being an orange card so that you have to relearn it. And then what's going to happen to it? Like, remember how for new cards, what happened to the cards when they were in the learning queue, when they were orange, was determined by what we wrote in this box. And similarly, if we go to lapses, we also have a steps box, and we can add in numbers that's going to determine what's going to happen to the card before it regraduates. The default is just to have 10 right here, which means you fail the card, it comes up again in 10 minutes. If you pass it, then it graduates. So it's only one number. We could add a second one of 100, in which case we're reviewing a card that we know. We press again, it shows up in 10 minutes. At the end of that 10 minutes, if we press good, then it's going to show up in 100 minutes. At the end of the 100 minutes, if you press good again, then it finally graduates. So what happens to lapsed cards when they're in the learning queue before they regraduate is all determined by this box. It works the same as this box. So the default is just 10-minute review. But then what is the new interval going to be after it regraduates? So remember, with new cards, we had a graduating interval, right? Which meant, okay, this is what's going to happen to it when it's an orange card. When it becomes a green card, this is what's going to happen to it. And these two didn't affect each other. Well, in the same way, this new interval right here, this determines what the new interval is going to be when it regraduates. And that is basically unrelated to what happens to it when it's in the learning queue and it's an orange card. And so this is a percentage, right? So what this means is that you can decide what percentage of the previous interval you wanted it to maintain. So if we set this to 50%, what that means is that, so we're reviewing this card. So this card right now has an interval of 29 days. So if we were to fail it, then it would show up in 10 minutes. And at the end of the 10 minutes, if I clicked good, then it would graduate and it would have an interval of 15 days, because that's 50% of the previous interval, which is 30 days. So the interesting thing is that basically the way that the learning queue works, so the way that this middle queue works is that whatever happens within the learning queue doesn't affect what happens to the card when it leaves the learning queue. So you could say what happens in the learning queue stays in the learning queue. So basically, when you hit fail on a card, then what happens is, well, it goes back to the learning queue, it goes through these steps, then it graduates, and it has a certain percentage of its old interval, right? And then it gets actually 20 percentage points subtracted from the ease factor. So the again button is the largest penalty when it comes to ease factor. But the interesting thing is that once it's already in the learning queue, you can fail it as many times as you want, and that won't affect the new interval once it graduates, and it won't affect the ease factor. Because like I said, what happens in the learning queue stays in the learning queue. So you could fail the card, it comes up after 10 minutes, you fail it again, it comes after 10 minutes, fail it again, you could fail it 100 times, and once you press good on that card, then it's still going to have, in the case of the card we saw a second ago, a 15-day interval, because it's 50% of the interval it had before you failed it. So that's the interesting thing. Now the bad thing about steps is that, for example, let's say that you made it 2, 30, 100, 1,000, right? So you fail it, comes up in 2 minutes, you pass it, comes up in 30 minutes, you pass it, comes up in 100 minutes, you pass it, then it comes up in 1,000 minutes, you fail it. Well, you can't just go back to 100, you go all the way back and have to start again at 2 minutes. So it's kind of like trying to graduate a card in both of these, right? In both new cards and for lapses, it's like trying to climb up a cliff. No matter how close you get to the top of the cliff, if your fingers slip, you fall all the way to the bottom. And so that's the danger of having a lot of learning steps, is that if you fail one of the later steps, you don't just go back to the last one, you go all the way to the very bottom. And apparently this is going to change in Anki 2.1, which is the new version of Anki that's going to come out soon. But right now, in this version of Anki, there's nothing you can do about that. And so now to just look at the rest of these settings, minimum interval, this is just basically the smallest the new interval can possibly be. It's just set to 1 day. I don't really see the purpose of changing this. Then leech threshold. So basically, when a card lapses a certain amount of times, the default is 8, it becomes a leech, which basically just means that Anki puts a tag on the card that says leech. And if you if you have this option selected, that's all it does. Just you're repping a card, you failed it for the 8th time, you lapsed it for the 8th time, a little notification will pop up saying this card was a leech, and then Anki will add a tag to it. If you choose this option, it will add a tag and suspend the card. Then remember, a lapse is only when it goes from being green to orange. Once it's in the orange, like I said before, you can fail it as many times as you want. That won't count as a lapse. It only counts as a lapse when it goes from green to orange. And you can choose the number of lapses before a card becomes a leech. So you can make it 4 times. Then if it lapses 4 times, then you can tell it to suspend that card, because that probably means if you miss the same thing 4 times or 8 times, whatever, that probably means that that was a bad card. You either need to edit something about the card, change something about it, or just delete it. And then to go back to the reviews, so now you know what all the buttons do, but also there's this additional feature called the interval modifier that I need to talk about last. So the interval modifier is basically the ease factor for your entire option group, for all the cards in the decks that the option group applies to. Well, I should put it this way. The interval modifier is a percentage that the interval gets multiplied to at the end of each calculation when you press one of the buttons. So I already told you what all these buttons do normally, right? Like, so here's a review. We know what all these buttons do, right? So for example, when you take the good button, it takes the previous interval, multiplies it by the ease factor, multiplies it by the fudge factor, and then it multiplies it by the interval modifier. But since the interval modifier is 100% by default, that doesn't do anything, right? It's just multiplying it by 1. But if we were to make the interval modifier 120%, then that would make all the intervals grow 20% more quickly, because now when you press good, it would be the previous interval times the ease factor times the fudge factor times 120, because that's the interval modifier. And same thing, if you press easy, well, now it's going to be the previous interval times the ease factor times the easy bonus times 120 for the interval modifier, and it's going to grow that much more. So basically, the way that you want to use the interval modifier is that if you make this number larger than 100, that means that your intervals are going to be growing more quickly, which means that you're going to have less reps total. But your retention rate's probably going to be worse. You're going to be forgetting more things because you're taking more risks with regards to how quickly your intervals are growing. So if you're someone who has like a 99% retention rate, then you can actually bump up the interval modifier, have less reps, and then be spending less time on Anki, or spend the same amount of time on Anki but learn more things and still have a retention rate of like 85 or 90%, right? Which might be desirable because it's better to know 85% of 1,000 things than to know 99% of like 800 things, right? Like you'd literally know more things in the first case. And so it's not necessarily good to have the highest retention rate possible. You probably want to go for around 85 to 90, or maybe even 80 to 85, depending on what kind of material you're dealing with. And then you can use the interval modifier to make that happen. But conversely, if you make this number less than 100, then all your intervals are going to be growing more slowly. And this can be useful because if you have a really low retention rate, then you can choose to do more reps, but then remember everything better. So if you ever have a really difficult deck, you can just have a low interval modifier, and then all the intervals will grow more slowly. And then maximum interval is just the biggest that an interval can get before it stops growing, and by default you can see it's set to 10 years. And so now when a card gets an interval of 10 years, it just won't grow, it'll just stay at 10 years max. And I think that probably makes sense because, I mean, now you know the Anki algorithm is extremely simple, so it will probably break down when the intervals get that large. So it makes sense that, okay, just after 10 years, then keep them at 10 years, because if it gets any larger than that, the algorithm might not function anymore, you might forget them. And then here, bury related cards until the next day, that's the same as for the new cards, just it's for reviews instead of new cards. And so now you pretty much know what all the settings do. And then if we go to just the general tab, then this is just like, as you see right here, Anki tells you how long you've been studying. And so whenever you're studying, Anki has a timer going to keep track of that. But for example, if this was set to 60 seconds, then after 60 seconds pass on the same card, Anki stops counting because it's assumed that you basically are away from your computer. So let's say that you're reviewing and then you get a phone call and you go answer the phone call and then you forget to come back to your computer. And so Anki's open to one card for 60 minutes straight. Well, it's not going to say that you studied for 60 minutes because after the first 60 seconds, it just stops counting. But you can adjust this time manually. Like if you sometimes do spend 2 minutes just on the same card, then you can change this to 120 seconds, and that way it will be a more accurate count of how long you studied. And then automatically show timer. If you do this, then I think it just shows a timer on screen. Yeah, right here. It shows how long you've been on the card, if you want that. And then automatically play audio. That's just if you have audio on your card, it'll automatically play it. When answer shown, replay both question and answer audio. So if you have audio on the front side of a card, then when you show the answer and this box is checked off, it will also replay the audio that was on the front of the card. And then description, this is just, you can write whatever you want right there, and then when you click on the deck, it'll show that here. This is mostly just a feature for pre-made decks. People write a description about their pre-made deck so that when other people download it, they have the information about it. And so that's it for this video. So now you know how the Anki algorithm actually works. I'll review it one more time right here. So the standard button is the good button. When you press the good button, it takes the previous interval and it multiplies it by the ease factor. The ease factor doesn't get changed. When you press the easy button, it takes the previous interval, it multiplies it by the ease factor, and then by the easy bonus, so it's growing by even more, but then it also adds 15 percentage points to the ease factor, meaning that if you keep pressing just good in the future, the card's going to be growing faster for all of eternity than it would have otherwise. And then if you press the hard button, it takes the previous interval, multiplies it by 1.2, and then subtracts 15 percentage points from the ease factor. So if you pressed easy, and then the next time you pressed hard, the ease factor will even out, and it'll be as if you pressed good twice. So that's something to think about if you want your cards to, not have too low of an ease factor. And then when you press again, it goes back to the learning queue. It counts as a lapse. It will go through the steps that you set in the lapse page of your settings. And then once it passes through all the learning steps, the new interval will be a percentage of the previous interval, which you set manually. And it will also subtract 20 percentage points from the ease factor, which is a really big hit, because if you just fail it a couple times, then that card's going to be growing very slowly for the rest of its life until you press easy on it. And there you have it. And I will also say that there's a minimum ease factor of 130%. If you get your ease down to 130% on a card, then no matter how many times you press fail or again or hard, the ease factor doesn't get any smaller, because if it got down to 100%, then it literally wouldn't grow, right? Because if it just multiplied the previous interval by 100% when you press good, then the interval would stay the same, and then if you kept making new cards, you would just have more and more reps because your intervals would never grow. So in order to avoid that, there's a minimum ease factor of 130%. And so yeah, that's it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about how to use all of this knowledge to strategically change all of your Anki settings to make it so that you have as few reps as possible while maintaining a good retention rate. So stay tuned to that. Ask any questions if something didn't make sense. And yeah, see you later, guys.